Are people cool with that? Like if we spend the first some minutes tomorrow doing the same thing for the other principles, just so we sort of have like a big reasonable selection.
Well, we can take tomorrow that we do the first two, and then on Thursday do another two from last week, or three, split it up with 3 per day.
Oh yeah. Yeah, so we can start with taking, right, so we have, I guess it's last week, right? So it's 6 of them. So we can take 3. Yeah.
Cool.
All right.
So,
we're live on YouTube.
You want to go ahead and start and run the first part, Oscar?
There we go. Cool. So welcome back to the eighth session of Principle Seminar on Transparency. So first, the principle itself. We strive for complete openness and symmetry of information within the organization, and have no border between our. Yeah.
Oscar, did you want to do the wall of shame first before you did your presentation?
Yeah, I will. I'm just and have no border between our co-contributors and our community. We are frank about our shortcomings, especially when making short-term trade-offs in service of our long-term goals. So we'll do the same thing here and go through everyone. Michael, do you want a cat herd? Well, I'll get started. Actually. All right, not here. Barry. Are people hearing me all right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Ghana?
Nothing.
Danny? All right. JB?
I'm here.
Excellent. Welcome.
So for me, it's probably like a maybe like more of a user focus. I don't think it's yet very clear as to like how transparent we are about what information we store, how we track, or if we track. So I think from a user perspective, I don't think we're very actually transparent, funnily enough, about what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I mean that from the point of view like opening up the app. Like I don't think it's clear enough as to what we're doing.
Yep. Cool. Alexi?
No input for now. Sorry.
All right. Ricardo?
Nothing.
Right. Yuri?
Sorry, I got disconnected. It just came back.
So it's about like ways we are not sort of living up to the principle of transparency.
Right. I think on Embark itself, we do a lot of things sort of internally, so to speak. And this is something we're actually not that happy about, and we're thinking to be a bit more open about our processes and making them more transparent to the world in order to comply more with the status principles.
Do you have some specific example?
Well, for example, we use a pivotal tracker, and that's private. We discuss a lot of things privately, and we're thinking maybe to have a more public bug tracker and discuss things more in public channels and things like that.
Yeah. Cool.
And yeah, but there's a sort of this ongoing discussion in terms of transparency versus privacy on that, because it's normal for people to have private discussions about development, but we just want to make it in such a way that if someone sees a PR or a bug fix, they know what's the context behind that, and it doesn't just show up out of nowhere.
Yeah. Cool. Sean?
Yeah, so I guess from a marketing standpoint, we're constantly trying to improve privacy. I think one thing we are trying to explore is how we can incorporate the community into a lot of our decision making and empowering them to actually be a part of the process.
Cool. Cool. Right. So I guess that is sort of the community is not involved in decisions, kind of.
They are. There's quite a few barriers still in place, so we're trying to remove barriers as much as possible.
Cool. All right.
Now you need to go over to the panelists because there's 7 panelists in addition to the 7.
Yeah. Carrie?
Hi, is the idea that we all suggest something around transparency for the wall of shame?
Yes.
Cool. I think mine would be kind of sort of similar to Yuri's, that I think there's like work that happens that isn't always visible. I'm always curious, and I always wonder like what percentage of the meetings we have result in any kind of artifact, like written notes that people can follow along with. But that's also balanced then against, the thing that we hear about there being like an information overload. But I do think that we haven't quite nailed like full transparency, even within the group of core contributors, over like the work that's happening and the rationale behind decisions that get made.
Yeah, cool. Michael? No financial disclosure policy statement. Could you elaborate?
Well, so we're talking. We've been having this discussion about what degree of information we're going to disclose. If we don't even know what that is, I mean, we need to have some sort of financial disclosure policy and statement that says, okay, this is data that we need to keep private for these reasons. I mean, we did discuss this in an earlier. I forget which one it was, but we need to have some sort of.
We discussed this in openness, that there is this privacy concerns, like a strategic privacy regarding some aspects, such as the ENS audit that we are going to release public now, but it was private until everything was fixed.
So what I'm talking about is specifically if there's data that we are choosing to not be transparent about, or that we can't be transparent about, and we just need to say what that data is and give a reason for it.
Cool.
It's okay. It's okay if we justify it, so to speak.
Absolutely.
So
Danny, Danny, you said something. Let's just list the things, and then we can talk about it more after.
I quickly posted a comment. So sorry that I missed out.
Could you say it out loud? Prior
shout out. So for finances, to me the transition period to the DAO is still unclear, since the salaries are still a very delicate issue. I mean, once we're at the DAO, everything is public, but I mean, to open it up now, I don't see the roadmap for the transition from the state that we are now in to the DAO. And then also some payment details might also be delicate once we are in a DAO. I'm thinking about if somebody has some health issues and gets therefore some payments for that via the state somehow. So probably nobody or only a few people would be open to disclose that. So that would need to be covered via a separate channel, or maybe somehow implemented via a very broad network.
Yeah, cool. Ben?
Yeah, I think similar to JB's point, I think just trying to understand what transparency really means in the context of Incubate. We'd love to be, we need to build a path as well, a roadmap on how to implement a more transparent process when it comes to the incubator, whether it's through the applications or the evaluation or community involvement and what have you. Yeah, so I think we just need to think about it more and really map something out, because it's not clear to me exactly what full transparency means in this context.
Cool. Corey?
I'd say the same thing there, but quick comment, like in regards, if we hold ourselves relative to almost every other company in the entire world, we're ridiculously transparent. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just like, but if we hold ourselves to our own standards, I'm not terribly sure what transparency exactly means, and what specifically we're striving for outside of like give all the things to everybody in as many ways possible.
Cool. Johnny?
Yeah, to kind of what Corey said, I think that we are insanely transparent as well. I would give us much more credit than, I think we're being a little hard on ourselves. We're pretty good at being transparent. But also with kind of what Carrie said, where we have like a lot of channels and like how decisions are being made and who are making those decisions, I think it's kind of hard to see where those ideas and thoughts like kind of all came from, because it's just like so much information.
Yeah. Cool. Richard?
So I think that at least from the development perspective, sometimes we are having meetings where we make decisions or reach conclusions. And I think it is important to publish this conclusion in public channels for people to learn about them and sharing these results, so the knowledge is shared and not kept into a few people.
All right, cool. I had some things, let's see here. So as a non-co-contributor, it's sort of not clear what sort of the starting point is. Like where to make an impact and see recent sort of state of things. And where and so on. Yeah. What else to do? We lack sort of canonical guarantees. So as a specific example, we talk about darkness a bunch. We're going to be better about this, but we talk about darkness, but we don't have sort of disclaimers or state clearly in our docs what we mean and where sort of what the problems are on that. There's a bit of a problem in terms of we have this sort of in between DAO and sort of some central company model, and that also means that there's sort of some issues with. I'll talk about this later, but in terms of principal agent problem essentially. So what the status multisig is paying for exactly. Versus sort of having a tenure model where sort of you get hired and then you work or whatever. Lack of sort of documenting specific decisions. We do this sort of haphazardly, but not sort of in a easy to track way.
If you could add another one for me, this discussion's now been coming up with this most recent nightly release that we had that made it through. We don't even have processes, our testing processes, our quality assurance processes, our security processes for how we do releases documented anywhere.
I think we do, but discovering that is a problem. Yeah. But
easily discoverable. Sorry.
I agree. Cool. And also lack of sort of async meeting notes that are sort of async sort of consumable meeting notes. I think someone else, I mentioned this. Cool. Anyone else who wants to add stuff? Yeah.
So should we look together in the openness notes? Maybe I think transparent and note openness means kind of the same, but not this exactly. They have an intersection, because the openness is like you are open to to participation, but also open in information. In transparent, you don't have to be open, but you need to be only. Everyone needs to see everything. The whys in the hows. Actually, we have some problem in the transparency, I think, regarding documentation, but I think that's justifiable because we are constantly changing everything to improve it. But I think transparent always also ties together with these documentations.
Cool. So Graham, I think I saw you raise your hand, and then let's move on to Oscar's presentation after that.
Yeah, I mean, with regards to transparency, again, on Corey's point, like ridiculously transparent in terms of all the meetings are up on YouTube, all the docs are super, you know, they're all up on the website. The GitHub repos are really well maintained. I think with regards to, yeah, just to kind of double down on the point of, it's not entirely clear or transparent for someone who wants to get involved, because there's so many different avenues and so much data to get through to actually suss out, okay, where could I participate or where could I be of value?
Cool. All right.
So why don't you follow up now? There.
Yeah. Awesome. So get started. So I think this just sort of briefly in terms of how I look at like why this matters. Some of the slides will touch on it, but just before I forget, in terms of 2 reasons why I think it's really important. Or a few reasons. So one is in terms of, as already been mentioned, in terms of contributors, that we are not trying to be a company, we're trying to be like sort of a thriving open source product. And that means that it's easy to sort of get this tunnel vision that we as co-contributors, we know there's this tribal knowledge, like, oh, you just ask this person and so on. But that doesn't sort of scale and doesn't work for other contributors. So we need to sort of be mindful of someone completely new being able to participate. And remember when I joined, and I joined some sort of chat channel, and then I had problems with the build for a bit, and I was talking to someone, I forgot, I think it was Andre for a bit, and he helped me out. And sort of just having it be easy to get started, and sort of having empathy for this sort of first journey, and making it easy for people to join. That's one reason. Another is in terms of the fact that we actually raised a bunch of money in ICO, and there are sort of certain promises made, a certain responsibility we have to sort of our token holders in terms of what we're actually doing with all these funds and how we're spending it and so on. And finally, also responsibility to our users in terms of technical faults and so on, because right now people don't take us serious enough. But if we want to be taken seriously and we want people to depend on us, this could potentially be a matter of sort of life and death if we actually do what we want to do. And actually being serious about what can you trust us for and why and so on is extremely important. Yeah. So privacy and transparency, one way of sort of thinking about them is in terms of privacy for individuals and individual matters, and transparency for institutions. And one example of this would be in terms of the project and that sort of being a collective effort, and also in terms of funds. Versus sort of private matters where you sort of just chit chat with your friends and so on. And there's obviously some edge cases, but as a rule of thumb, I think it's pretty useful. And this concept of sort of symmetry of information. So as a heuristic, someone who doesn't have special privileges, whether that's sort of a Google account or some tribal knowledge or whatever, they should have access to the same information to contributors as us core contributors. And this also ties into making things as consumable that plenty of people mentioned, and we're doing a better job now than a few months ago, but we can still do better in terms of meeting notes, also agendas, decision records, and so on. There's also this idea of sort of asymmetric information when it comes to principal agent problem. And in our case, it's a bit muddled because we still, right now, we have this sort of multi-sig, which is from this one-time event where we had this ICO and there's sort of multi-sig, and then there's sort of a corporation. And this is sort of sponsoring people in some way without having this sort of people lead structure and so on. And people are sort of expected to act in sort of status-based interests and so on. But there's still a lot of sort of lack of information in terms of what are people actually hired for, and so what can be expected and so on. And I think we have a lot we talked about this in terms of decentralization as well, what can sort of be expected and to what extent do we want to pay for time versus for tasks and so on. It's still an open problem, but just in terms of, thinking about this and thinking about sort of being mindful about good ways of addressing this problem. Because it's much bigger in an organization where you don't have this sort of strict hierarchy in terms of agents actually being transparent about what we're doing and what is sort of paying the principal for, whether that's some individuals, a set of token holders, or it's a status multisig or what have you. As a specific example, so Nimbus received a Ethereum grant, foundation grant, not too long ago, and that was sort of based on prior work and a reputation and participating in these sort of dev calls, and then also sort of expectations in terms of delivering certain things. Right now, we don't have sort of that very clear, I would say. It's of course different across the organization, whether you work in core as an engineer or people ops and so on. So it looks different, slightly different in different parts of the organization. The way I look at sort of Random Joe journey, that this should be able to have some in. Maybe it's a bug they notice, or maybe they're interested in some specific effort. But it should sort of be able to get a clear overview very quickly about the priorities and sort of where they can contribute, and then sort of join some group of people, and they can sort of see, well, here's what this team or this swarm is working on, and here's how I can contribute, and then sort of clear calls to action and so on. This is sort of an inclusivity activity, if you will. When it comes to being transparent about shortcomings, so there's this sort of old code of Hammurabi, which is a way of getting symmetry. And the way it works is that back in the old day, if you built a house, you were sort of you know most about the folks in that house. So if someone moves in to that house and they die, then you should also be put to death. And this is obviously very gruesome, and it doesn't apply nowadays, but it's still a useful principle because us as builders of this app and so on and our status, we know the most about what the faults are, so we should be extremely clear about fronting them. And I talk about in terms of security guarantees and these types of things. There's also a way to sort of marketing proofreading and sort of process around that. And yeah. In terms of short-term F trade-offs, obviously want to minimize it. We're also going to better at this, I think, as we've taken more principled approach to development versus before, where it was more haphazard, perhaps. But when we do, we should sort of document decisions properly. As an example here, we have this, we should probably move this to a Docker repository, but here is, we decided to disable group chats, and here you can sort of see the context. The context is that we want to launch a beta. The decision is we disable it, and the consequences that is disabled, and you can't sort of chat in private groups. So this is very useful in terms of referring to it later, and people can get some understanding of why things came to be. Also want to point some inspiration. So Augur is another sort of big player in this space, and they have this really neat thing. They have a sort of specific transparency model and reports, and they sort of have their finances open. They have quarterly reports where they say how they spend the funds, similar to us, and public meetings and so on. And they have a government community model, community governance model, which is also transparent. So that's just some inspiration in terms of how we can be even more transparent. And that's it for me. Thank you.
All right. Cool. So this is probably the one place where we have a lot less to be ashamed about than anywhere else. I'd like to, so we have these, our town hall meeting, and we now have the core dev call, and I've been encouraging other teams to record their calls and post notes. How do you guys feel about, since now that we're moving off of Slack, we have a lot less of this chattiness, and we're dividing our daily involvement with each other in status, and then longer form in discuss. How do you feel about expanding this form of communication out, where teams record their calls and post them to discuss as a way for us to be more transparent inside of the organization and outside of the organization? Do you guys like the idea of that, taking this model that we started with Corporate Call and town halls?
I like the idea, but the problem is that these recordings can be extensive. So maybe to some, let's say, token holder to follow up, maybe they don't have all the time to follow up.
That's not necessarily our problem. I'm more concerned about people inside of the organization being able to keep up. Like Carrie has mentioned, decisions get made and things happen, and we don't have a way to actually look at that. In my feedback at the end of the 3 months, it came back that somebody mentioned that I was making decisions that they didn't know about, and I sort of hairs went up on the back of my neck, and I thought, well, I'm collaborating with the people that I'm collaborating with, and we're informing people inside of Slack channels, and there's plenty of conversations that I'm not party to, where decisions are made about things that I'm not really involved in, but I'd like to know about. So do you guys think that this could be a good way for us to stay more informed about each other, that we can click in and listen to things if we want to about issues that we're interested in on a team basis?
So this is actually, would the goal that you're trying to accomplish by doing that be equally accomplished if just a one-page summary of bullets of key takeaways or decisions at the meeting were shared, rather than recording every meeting and sharing hours of that? Would the same goal be accomplished that way?
I think the most transparent thing to do would be that all of our calls, group calls, I don't mean individual calls, but team calls, that they should be recorded the same way that we do town halls and are doing these things.
But do you think that that's a useful way of promoting?
Sorry. Could you answer my question though, which is, would your goal still be accomplished if we simply record meeting notes and share that?
I think that would be a step, and I think that would be a step in the right direction. But we're talking here though is about transparency. So there's some sort of efficiency balances that we need to, trade-offs that we need to make. But yeah, of course, that would achieve more than we have at the moment.
I think having both, we achieve all what we need, because not everyone have the time to watch all these videos. But if you have these notes, then you can maybe have the link of the time that the person mentioned that information, so you can have be more productive to following these decisions.
I don't know if that's a useful way of being transparent, to be honest. It just sounds like complete overkill, and probably is going to appeal to a very, very small number of people. And it would be probably a lot more useful if there was what Akshay recommended, which is like a summary of each meeting. I feel like if we do that, we're just doing it for the sake of being transparent, as opposed to really thinking about what would be the most efficient and best way to go forward.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. So we have on our channels HackMD document. Some of the teams that now have team pages. Could we maybe think about having team and project pages, which then point to conversation documents that are updated regularly? Is that something we could think about?
Something else that we could potentially consider is having like a weekly document. So as opposed to every call, we have like a weekly write-up, like a weekly review on Friday or whatever makes sense. And that's one way of communicating everything that we've done that week, as opposed to just specific calls. Oh, it's up to the people in whatever team they're in, right?
Can we do? I think tags can help with what Michael mentioned in terms of like if we're using notes.status.im, then the tags associated with the docs you're doing could automatically work on various pages. It just basically filters out whatever has that tag. We just have to define what tags to use.
Well, I think that, so what I'd like to see happen in this sense.
Let me just show you guys what we have in terms of this. Like we already have this, so you have this discoverability, right? It can still be better, but you have this. And here, for example, you can see core chat sync. They have sort of their meeting notes here and also links and so on. So that's one example, a very sort of simple way you can do it. But I just want to ask you a quick question, because it seemed like in the beginning, people, it wasn't completely clear like why we want transparency and so on. I tried to sort of give my personal answer. Do people agree with that? Do people disagree? Do people think we are going overboard, or what are people's thoughts before sort of diving deeper into how to do it?
So I agree with it.
I don't have access to these notes.
You should, if you go to notes.status.im.
No, I don't. Maybe later I'm trying to, but.
Oscar, I think to your question, I agree with your points, but I'm just having trouble reconciling the difference between transparency for the sake of being transparent and with no real end goal, and with being transparent where it really makes sense to be transparent.
So I think, yeah, so I think building on Ben's point, I think Yuri mentioned this earlier too, in terms of a trade-off potentially between transparency versus privacy. So an example could be salaries and things like that. But there are other areas where I think transparency as a topic also needs to be balanced with or somehow can compromise other things. So for example, transparency versus strategic advantage, transparency versus competitiveness, transparency versus, those are not as important, but transparency versus, for example, negotiating power, right? Like, so let's say we are trying to partner with 5 different groups and choosing between them, and we record and are transparent about every single transaction or every single, conversation, then by definition, we get the worst part of the deal.
Is that the space we want to be in, though, in terms of having these? Because that's definitely like a mental model, like you lock down things as much as possible and you keep trade secrets and so on. Is that sort of the universe we want to play in?
I think though there's a, I mean, it's not really about that. I think it's just sometimes we have thoughts that are perhaps not completely formed, or they are still in progress. And that's something that sometimes in meetings get, they might get flushed out. But if everything is always fully transparent all the time, you might get the wrong idea potentially.
So to sum this up, I guess what it is that we're talking about is like, why do we specifically want to be transparent? And I postulate a couple of things. One, we'd like to have token holders to have as much information as possible about us because they've invested their money in it. And we'd like to have potential community members have as much information about us as possible. And then internally, different groups and teams and initiatives, projects that are working together should have as much information as possible. I think we can also agree that there's trade-offs and balances that need to be made with that. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really good that we are starting with the goal of, why do we want to be transparent? Because if you start with the goal, there can be 5 different ways to achieve that goal, and one might be better than the other. And radical full transparency by sharing everything and the sort of like the barrage and the volume of it may not necessarily be the best way to get to the same goal. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I think we're all in agreement about that, and that each individual team is making a discretionary choice about what it is that they're not being transparent about based on trade-off arguments that we potentially define in certain policy documents similar to privacy documents.
Do we think that
so I think
do we think that by providing too much transparency, you then run into the issue of it becoming overwhelming for a community member or a token holder?
So I think absolutely, and I think that goes a little bit to what Yuri was saying as well, which is, what are we trying to be transparent about? Are we trying to be transparent about the how, the what, and that's the major thing, or is it also the how? But I guess what I'm saying is, do people need to know every step in the process and every word and every sentence and I guess even every step in the process? Because we could arrive at a conclusion or, a decision after eliminating 50 different things in the conversation. But if a listener has 5 hours of listening to do to understand what the conclusion was, they might not listen to the full 5 hours. They might listen to the first hour and have a completely different interpretation or takeaway just because they didn't listen through to the end, right? This is not just about listening to recordings. It's just about if every single piece of information is out there, there's just a lot more left to interpretation versus what actually got decided or was done.
But
yeah, so I think we're in
question,
agreement
right?
about that not being necessary, that we're not that granular. I think what we're trying to get at is some sort of like balanced medium that allows us to keep ourselves informed inside of the core contributor group. And that's
I would also push back a bit on that sort of mental model. We definitely don't need. It's not that every piece of information is useful, but you don't necessarily know what piece of information. And to me, the part of that mental model is that we are doing the work and other people are consuming it. And that's not really what I think we should be pushing for. What we should be pushing for is other people joining us. And if we want people to significantly contribute to our work, then they probably need to be aware of what we have discarded and actually being able to contribute. If you just present them with the solution, then how can they help?
Yeah, a good example of that is just yesterday, Bruno suggesting a collaborative format for blog posts. It's on Discuss, and then me coming up and talking about permissionlessness with our status. I mean, we do have successive rings of trust inside of the organization, and also outwards towards our community and how we participate with each other. I think we need to recognize that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the what part of, what and why, I think even why is important, right? So why are we doing something that we're doing, in order for people to understand what the purpose, the strategy, the goal, the vision, the mission, or whatever of every single project that we're doing is, before talking about what the decisions around it were. That I think I'm completely in line with. I mean, that's why Studio's strategy and roadmap is all publicly available. But I guess all I'm saying is, starting with, to someone's point about one of the goals is to give token holders the maximum amount of information in order to make decisions about whatever that might be X, because they hold tokens. Starting with something like that will help us also parse like what kinds of information are important to provide, right? So the what, why, the key decisions, but is it really important to provide information around, I don't know, the 50 things that were left on the cutting floor?
Cool. I think we're in agreement about that we don't need to be so granular. I'd like to move a little bit forward. I
have something that's slightly different.
Yeah.
Real quick,
please.
In terms of this, I don't know how Status makes money or the runway associated with with the funds that we have, and I can't, as a core contributor, I don't understand what the future of the company is financially. And I think that's something we should probably have at some point, so that investors who would maybe like to purchase Status tokens and invest in the company via the tokens, or core contributors can understand what our roadmap is and how, like, I guess the financially business side of this company, how it runs, and what the projected runway of things is, and how we're working on those runways.
So I think that there's going to be a lot of stuff happening in Prague. I know that the founders are thinking about these things and are going to be making presentations and raising these issues. So I'd like to ask, where are our gaps? Do we have any gaps in our efforts? Referring to slide 7 from Oscar's presentation.
Is that showing right now? Because I don't see anything.
No, I've just got it open on my own screen.
Can we show it, please?
So it's the No Borders Random Joe journey. And it says 1, discover gaps, efforts, and prios. 2, join Cool Team and Status. 3, check home for recent and prios. And 4, contribute in chat, discuss PRs. is what's on the slide. So that's not a token holder, but it's a random person showing up to status to get involved.
I think that's a great use case for the transparency, because having these transparent discussions open the discussion to other people that want to join us with collaborations. So I think perhaps we need a new platform to making these calls, to maybe later export them in a more efficient way. Maybe link the notes to whatever the people was talking to.
Okay, I think we're moving towards that model. So let's move then to the wall of shame that we collaborated on at the beginning, and go through those point by point, because we're at 10 minutes before the hour. Let's see. Does anybody want to jump in on the points that they made when we started the document?
I think that it's important to record the most calls possible.
Okay, no, I'm not talking about the calls anymore. I'm talking about the wall of shame point by point that we each added to in the collective document.
So sorry, I didn't add to the wall of shame, but maybe this is something that is worth mentioning, and it's not related to recording the meetings. Is I think that someone raised this question about financial transparency or sort of runway. I'm not advocating for necessarily making that kind of information public, because I think that does, and depending on the granularity that we share it with, I think sharing it publicly might encroach on other things like privacy and salaries and things like that. But one step towards that direction is perhaps being a little bit more transparent about that, even internally, just amongst the core contributors as a start. And so an example of that, I think that I've seen done well at Consensus actually, is at the town halls at Consensus, there is an anonymous forum to submit. In fact, there are town halls that we had that were entirely this format where anonymous questions were submitted from across the mesh. And every question that was submitted had to be answered by quote unquote management, which is, one human being at Consensus. But the point being that the entire town hall was uncensored, and every single question had to be addressed, and questions ranged from runway to, for example, the price of ETH is tanking for this period. What does that mean for our hiring numbers? What does that mean? What does it mean in terms of strategically entering different markets? Which market is more important, et cetera, or even about culture of the org, et cetera. But I guess what I'm proposing is that it might be helpful to have a forum, at least internally first, amongst core contributors, where people can anonymously ask questions that are not filtered, that, let's say, some of the core leadership of the group then has to answer internally.
Okay, so we're talking about a certain amount of accountability. Is there an expectation of accountability from the financial officers and the voting officers of the legal entities that we have? Is that what we're saying?
I guess less accountability for me and more transparency, just, where things stand.
Okay, cool. So any technical issues that people want to get into from the list that we started on transparency on the wall of shame?
I'd just like to maybe one way you think about this in contrasting status versus like an open source organization, because right now pretty much all of us are sort of paid by a single or two or whatever legal entities, and we all have sort of a shared Google account and so on, and there's sort of homogeneity there. Whereas if you look at something like Linux or so, you don't necessarily have that, and you're sort of forced to be transparent by default because people are not even using the same Google instance. They have their own emails and sort of own lives and so on. And just in terms of the starting point, I think that has an impact in terms of how you think about going forward. And I would like us to be even more segregated and more decentralized and not using the same systems and so on. I don't know if people have any thoughts on
Can you elaborate on that, Oscar? What does Linux do?
No, I mean, for one thing, like we have our own Google accounts, right? Which means that we all have the same permissions. So people don't think twice about sharing some document that requires permissions, because it's assumed that everyone is going to look at it, have the same permissions, because they're all status employees. But if you're doing a proposal that's a no-go, you can't do that, right? Because it's going to look at it. You have to work at Red Hat if you like. It's just a nonsensical thing to do. But in status, it's an uphill battle, because it's not a nonsensical thing to do, because we sort of share the same systems. We previously used Slack and Google and so on. And I think that's sort of it's a different starting point, and that's why it's partly an uphill battle, I would say, from where I'm standing. Does that reasoning make sense to people?
Yes, it does. I think that our problem or the conflict comes from the fact that we're not really as honest with ourselves about what it is that we are as we should be. We are legacy companies aspiring towards a DAO, and I think that this disconnect comes from that.
I feel like the process towards radical transparency is not something that happens overnight, and that we should be tactful in our approach, and it should be step by step. I don't think it means that tomorrow we wake up, because we're not a DAO yet, and because we're not a DAO, we need to ensure that we make gradual steps towards becoming a DAO, and that includes putting in those building blocks of transparency along the way, as opposed to one day waking up and saying, okay, everything's transparent, everything should be recorded, everything, financials are public, and what have you. I don't think that's a tactful approach.
And as is becoming a DAO, it will also raise problems in the privacy concerns, I think.
Well, it sure is an exciting experiment. I really love being part of it. And I really enjoy these conversations with you. I think that we accomplish a lot. Do we have any action points that we'd like to put on our notes, Oscar, or anybody specifically? That's something we should try and include in these conversations as action points.
Just one for me. So we have a People Up School coming up, and I'll make sure that we talk about kind of the financial transparency point, because that's been raised a few times, and we talked about that ourselves. So maybe the action is to kind of come back to the group and talk about how much financial transparency we can have and why.
I've got plenty of thoughts on that. So if you want to include me on whatever that action item is, I'd like to be a part of it.
Sure thing.
Cool. Any of our core devs in here have some action points that they'd like to include on this document in attacking this wall of shame about transparency in terms of darkness guarantees and message reliability, etc.?
I mean, Breaking Whisper is an attempt to be more transparent about what the limits of Whisper is. So there's not necessarily a need for an action item, but then just, I guess, an overall note that we are working on things like that. And it's just a matter of time to get there, because it's not something you can just figure out in a week, especially if you have a lot of other duties across the company.
Cool. I'd say that about sums us up. You want to have a closing statement there, Oscar?
No, I agree. Thank you so much for everyone for participating. And yeah, I think the sort of participation was quite well. Like it was better than previous sessions, I think, with One Shame and so on. So it's really good to hear everyone's perspective. Yeah, awesome. Thank you, everyone. And see you tomorrow for resourcefulness and continuance. And we'll probably do sort of the Wall of Shame stuff for some other principles as well, if people are right for that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.